Hello, class. Welcome to week 4 of BMN 507 Bible Overview. Just want to remind you that next week is the midterm exam. So this week we'll have a little study guide at the end of the session to help you prepare for that. But let's go ahead and get started with the lesson. All right. We'll be covering today chapter 5 of the book, The Nation of Israel, which covers the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Those are known as the former prophets. If you look at the Hebrew categorization of the Tanakh or Old Testament. So the Pentateuch ends with the promise to the ancestors unfulfilled. The descendants of Abraham have become numerous, but they are a wandering band, not a great nation. The people have been blessed by the Lord, who has delivered them from Egyptian slavery and entered into a covenant relationship with them. But their name is not yet great, nor have they become a source of blessing to other nations. And they are still at the border of the promised land. It is not yet theirs. So the next section of the Tanakh, the former prophets, continues the narrative that began in Genesis 12, telling the story of the people of Israel from their entry into the promised land to their exile from that land. The books of the former prophets hold to the position that obedience to the Lord leads to blessing and disobedience leads to disaster for the nation and for individuals. Because this point of view is presented so clearly in Deuteronomy, many modern interpreters feel that the former prophets and Deuteronomy form what they call the Deuteronomistic history. Rather than attempting a thorough analysis of the literary and historical worlds of the former prophets, we will present overviews focusing on particular literary units as examples of the whole and on specific historical questions. All right, let's start with the occupation of Canaan in the books of Joshua and Judges. We'll look at the literary world's balance in Joshua 1 through 12 and Judges 1 through 2. So the books of Joshua and Judges tell an overlapping and sometimes conflicting story of the occupation of the land of Canaan by the tribes descended from the sons of Jacob, and of the situation that followed among the tribes. Our emphasis in this section will be to show how these two books balance each other. In the book of Joshua, all Israel, led by Joshua in strict obedience to the Lord, conquers the entire land of Canaan. We see that in Joshua chapters 1 through 12. In this account of the occupation, God continues to be portrayed as divine warrior who has charted the plan for the war. The Lord clearly intends the destruction of the people of Canaan, and Joshua's army follows the instructions earlier given to Moses, conducting what must be described as a genocidal campaign. They wipe out all the people, the women and the children, leave no survivors of the people that they conquered. Then the land is distributed among the tribes in accordance with the assignments made by Moses in Numbers. Joshua gives a farewell in which he reiterates that success for the people depends on allegiance to the Lord and his commandments. Finally, he gathers all the tribes together at Shechem for a covenant renewal ceremony. Although the book of Judges begins with the harmonizing note after the death of Joshua, it is soon obvious that Judges 1:1 through 2:5 is another account of some of the same events covered in Joshua, but from a much different perspective. And actually, Joshua is still alive in Judges 2:7. Now, whereas Joshua 1 through 12 portrays all Israel conquering the whole land, the first two chapters of Judges speak of individual tribes taking different areas and having great difficulty dislodging the inhabitants. These conflicting accounts create a historical problem to which we will soon turn. How did the tribes occupy the land? However, from a literary point of view, the two contrasting accounts function much like the two creation accounts in Genesis. Joshua's account of the occupation of the land as God intended is balanced by the more chaotic version of Judges. As the conclusion to the Judges account suggests, it was the disobedience of the people that led to a chaotic situation. Let's look at the historical world. How did the Israelites occupy Canaan? Three major hypotheses have been suggested by modern biblical historians to account for the Israelite settlement in Canaan. The first is a blitzkrieg or conquest model that follows the schematic history of the book of Joshua and is supported by some archaeological evidence. The second is a peaceful infiltration hypothesis that accords more closely with the narrative in Judges and also fits with a substantial amount of archaeological evidence. Third, an initial peasant revolt hypothesis was further developed into the notion that Israel originated in a revolt of Canaanite peasants against their aristocratic Canaanite overlords, though there is little direct literary evidence for this hypothesis, and some archaeological evidence or data seem to testify against it. The position taken by the textbook is that the origin of Israel, as portrayed in the biblical traditions, was an involved historical process and therefore unlikely to be explained by a single simple model. The approach to the question of the Israelite establishment in Canaan is to work out a synthesis of the complex biblical traditions and then to test this picture with the control provided by archaeological evidence. So beneath the stylized account in Israel that involves all Israel, there is an indication that more than a ritualistic conquest was involved. The inhabitants of Gibeon tricked Joshua into a treaty of peace, and no fighting is recorded in the neighborhood of Shechem, where Joshua conducted his great covenant renewal ceremony, which mentions sojourners as well as homeborn Israelites. The book of Joshua also recognizes that not all possible territory was conquered. Judges notes that others besides Joshua were involved as leaders. Judges also lists unconquered Canaanite centers and describes struggles with the Canaanites on a tribal level. The hypothesis proposed in the textbook begins by proposing that the Exodus group must have been relatively modest in size. The band probably included elements of the Joseph tribes, which eventually split into Ephraim and Manasseh. The tribe of Levi, and possibly others, but it also had acquired additional adherents, or a mixed multitude, who were not biological descendants of Jacob or Israel. So the Exodus group, led by Joshua, entered the lands west of Jordan near Jericho in the middle of the 13th century BCE, bringing with them the traditions of the Exodus and the Sinai covenant. They met a varied reception as they migrated toward the Central Highlands. Some settled on unoccupied land. In some instances, they were obliged to fight indigenous people. And others, local inhabitants, entered into treaty relationships with them. And yet others, other instances, they seem to have moved in peacefully among the indigenous population. In the process, additional peoples became parties to the Sinai covenant. Some might have been members of the traditional 12 tribes who had remained in Canaan rather than sojourning in Egypt. Some might have otherwise claimed kinship or some sort of special relationship from the past. Others were previously unrelated Canaanite groups, or Habiru, who made common cause with the prospering Israelites and adopted fidelity to the Lord. The activities of Joshua and other leaders during the 13th and 12th centuries gave the expanding group of tribes a firm establishment in the land of Canaan, but Canaan was not yet Israel. As the book of Judges shows, the Israelites were at times dominated by the Canaanites and at other times independent, but never did they decisively dominate the Canaanites. None of the judges was a national leader. Most led a single tribe or coalition of neighboring tribes. The indigenous urbanized population continued to control most of the great walled cities, as well as the lowlands constituting the agricultural vicinity of these cities. The situation was one that permitted some degree of peaceful coexistence, though instances of friction arose as a Canaanite ruler or Midianite raider saw the opportunity to oppress the Israelites, who were weaker due to their unfortified villages and tribal form of social organization. When aroused and led through guerrilla warfare, the Israelites proved strong enough to convince greedy neighbors that the cost of oppressing them was not worth it. So this balance persisted until about 1100 BCE. We noted previously that some sites in traditional Israelite territory seem to have been violently destroyed in the mid to late 13th century BCE, the most likely time for the events of the Exodus, wilderness wanderings, and occupation. These sites were occupied by people who utilized both a different pottery tradition and a different architectural tradition. Excavations of Hazor and Lachish lend support to the biblical narratives of their conquest. However, there is no evidence that the city of Jericho, which is the most celebrated or best known of Joshua's victories, was actually occupied during the 13th century. Archaeological evidence also shows that a substantial part of the Israelite settlement was a peaceful infiltration into vacant land rather than an armed invasion. Both in the hill country and in the Judean Negev, a substantial portion of the new people, as identified by their pottery, architecture, and subsistence strategy, settled on land that was unoccupied. The pastoral nomadism way of life was jeopardized when trade relations between highland pastoralists and lowland grain farmers were disrupted by the incursions of the sea peoples. That includes the Philistines that we're going to focus on later in the lesson. The Highlanders were obliged to settle down and pursue a mixed subsistence farming strategy, which initiated the rapid multiplication of small agrarian villages in the highlands during the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age transition, and permitted the highlands to support a larger population. At the conclusion of the book of Judges, the Israelites are pictured as living in villages with a tribal social organization and no major intertribal institutions. Also typical of a tribal culture is charismatic leadership, persons empowered with natural leadership gifts, as seen in the Judges. This type of leadership functions most effectively when people are galvanized or energized by the coincidence of a crisis and leader. The military behavior of the Israelites is consistent with what we would expect from anthropological models. The fighting force was essentially able-bodied men mustered by families and clans, but unable to maintain itself long in the field and lacking equipment to conduct sustained operations. Tribal society is also generally egalitarian with no elaborate or rigid status system. Many of the most fundamental traditions of the Torah were laid down in this period, and they are reflected in the law codes and oracles of the later prophets. Much of the ideological tension in later Israelite society would grow out of conflicts between the egalitarian tradition of its formative tribal culture and the pretensions of the higher orders generated by the development of a more complex and stratified society with more social classes. Archaeology joins literature in giving evidence of this tension seen in the monumental architecture that appeared with the monarchy, while residential housing remained basically egalitarian to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE. We'll turn now to the section from tribes to state, which talks about Judges and Samuel, and we'll look at the literary world, a cycle of legends about heroes. After its version of the occupation of Israel, most of the rest of Judges is a collection of legends about heroes among the tribes who demonstrated their leadership by delivering people from oppression at times of crisis. We would call them charismatic leaders, but their title comes from the stereotypical phrase that connects the legends, typically after telling of the exploit, the text says that the hero judged Israel. Thus, they are called judges. As an example of one of the legends about the charismatic heroes called judges, let us analyze the story of Ehud. Ehud was a member of the tribe of Benjamin, whose warriors were known for their military prowess. Ehud was left-handed, which is ironic because the name Benjamin refers to son of the right hand. And Ehud arose as a hero at a time of oppression at the hands of the nation Moab. Under the obese King Eglon, name meaning calf, Moab had taken Jericho and stationed an occupying army of at least 10,000 men in Israel. Eglon was to deliver Israel by killing the fatted calf, Eglon, and leading a massacre of the Moabite occupation force as they tried to flee for home. The clever Ehud prepares for his act by making a small two-edged sword which he puts on his right thigh under his cloak. And he's aware that a motion with his left hand toward his right thigh would not alarm his unsuspecting victim. I guess being left-handed is so uncommon that they wouldn't suspect someone to grab a sword from the right thigh with the left hand. It would be the opposite. So Ehud goes to Eglon to deliver tribute and starts for home before going back with a secret message. That word can also mean thing for the king. The gullible king falls for the trick and sends his attendants away. Alone in Eglon's private roof chamber, Ehud repeats his claim to a secret message or thing, identifying the source as God. When the king stands to receive it, Ehud delivers it, which is a stab to the stomach, and the king's rolls of fat close over the sword. It's kind of a graphic depiction, somewhat humorous, but also very graphic. Ehud makes his escape while the king's attendants think the king is relieving himself and should not be disturbed. In the subsequent battle, the Moabites are portrayed as mirroring their kings. They too are fools, for they rush toward home through the fords of Jordan that provide the Israelites excellent opportunities for ambush. 10,000 Moabites, described as strong and able-bodied, and that word could also mean fat, were killed just like their king. Probably they are not fat, but in shape, but just the word means the same thing. So it connects them to their fat king. The other legends of the judges are also popular folk tales about memorable people. Deborah, meaning honeybee, and Barak, meaning lightning. It's not Barack Obama, but maybe Barack Obama took his name from this character. Those are in Judges 4 through 5. Gibeon in Judges 6 through 8. Gideon, rather, Judges 6 through 8. Jephthah, Judges 11 through 12. And Samson, Judges 13 through 16. As in the ancestral legends, the portrayal of the judges as heroic figures does not mean they are beyond reproach. For example, Jephthah's foolish vow to make a sacrifice to the Lord, if granted victory, leads him to kill his daughter. He says he'll offer the next, whatever comes out of his house first. I'm not sure if he's expecting that to be an animal or if he's okay with the idea of human sacrifice, which was ultimately outlawed by the Israelites, but that law was not followed at this time, regardless. But I'm sure he did not expect his daughter to come out first to meet him. So this leads him to kill his daughter, unfortunately. And Samson's passion for the beautiful Delilah is his undoing. All of these stories are woven together as a cycle with a clearly stated theme introducing them, which becomes a pattern repeated in the stories. The people turn from the Lord and serve other gods. Second, the Lord becomes angry and allows them to be oppressed. Third, the Lord raises up judges to deliver them. And fourth, when the judge dies, the people turn again to evil and the cycle begins again. This pattern is illustrated in the short story of Othniel and then used as a framework for the other tales. First Samuel begins with the story of another hero who is associated with judging. Samuel, we might say he's the last judge. Samuel's judging, however, seems to involve the administration of justice, and he is not portrayed as a war hero like most of the heroes in the book of Judges. Samuel is a transitional figure between the loosely organized situation of judges and the emergence of Israel as a state under a king, though he is also a charismatic leader or hero who plays a role in the deliverance of the people. The next focal character, Saul, is also a charismatic and transitional figure. He is a Benjaminite who arises like the judges as a deliverer at a time of oppression. As a result, he is named king by the people. However, the story is balanced against other traditions concerning Saul's rise to power that suggest a certain ambiguity in Israel's remembrance of him. The narrative portrays Saul in tragic terms as he is rejected by God for a seemingly minor sin and overshadowed by the more charismatic David, who succeeds him, while he lacks the support or administration to govern effectively as king, or as a king. Let's turn to the historical world. The equilibrium between Israel and its Canaanite neighbors was upset by the activities of the Philistines, who appeared in Canaan during the 12th century BCE, or perhaps earlier. They were part of the sea peoples from the Aegean region. The Philistines became rulers of the Philistine plain and Bethshan, which controlled traffic around the southern end of the Sea of Galilee into the Jezreel Valley. The Philistines rapidly assimilated the culture of Canaan, probably because they were not very numerous. They were a warrior aristocracy, replacing the previous Canaanite warrior aristocracy. They had an advanced metals technology that allowed them to make superior weapons. They also had a more adaptive political system than the Canaanite city-states, organizing themselves under a national council, and they made wise use of well-armed infantry. All this was bad for the Israelites. Concentrated in the less productive hill country, the Israelites were relatively out of reach of the chariot-based armies of the principal Canaanite cities, but the Philistine infantry could march any place an Israelite could walk, and the Israelite citizen soldier was neither trained nor equipped to confront such formidable adversaries. Anthropologists observe that states tend to rise when an area becomes circumscribed or impacted. Either the population grows to the point that the habitable environment is pressed to the limits in its carrying capacity, or social developments have the effect of closing people in. Philistine activity created social restriction for the Israelites, who were forced to submit or organize to resist. The latter option required a trained standing army to fight the Philistine, not merely the guerrilla warfare of the Israelite tribal militias. To raise a standing army requires a reorganization of society with the emergence of social stratification, with the warrior class on top in league with bureaucrats and priests who organized the social system. Thus, it requires a system of centralized control. States also emerge in stages. Saul's kingdom appears to have been more like a chiefdom, an intermediate development, than a state-level monarchy. Nevertheless, Saul took the essential first step to statehood and created the catalyst for further development. He recruited a standing army and secured the central heartland of Benjamin and Ephraim against Philistine exploitation, while bringing the great southern tribe of Judah more fully into a total Israelite structure than it had been before. All right, let's look at from state to empire, the United Kingdom as seen in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings 1 through 11. We'll talk about the literary worlds, David and Solomon. The book of 2 Samuel focuses on the rule of David, first as king of the southern half of the territory of Israel, and then as king over the United Kingdom of Judah and Israel. The narrative weaves together a record of the achievements of David and a look behind the scenes at the intrigue of his court. So we'll talk about some of that. First Kings begins with the death of David and the rise of Solomon. It then portrays the reign of Solomon, who is known for his wisdom, administration, building projects, including the temple, and his wealth and success in trade, but with a fatal flaw. One section of this narrative in 2 Samuel 9 through 20 and 1 Kings 1 through 2 is often considered a single literary unit because of its unity of style and theme. It is called the succession narrative. Or simply the court history of David. The narrative begins against the background of 2 Samuel 7, the promise of the Lord to David delivered by Nathan the prophet. The prophets, again, are those that deliver messages from God, that his house and kingdom would be established forever. In broader perspective, this Davidic covenant, based on the promise of the Lord that there will always be a Davidic king, introduces a new tension. The full scope of this promise, especially when viewed after the destruction of Jerusalem and exile of the house of David, leads to the hope for a Messiah or an anointed ruler who will arise from the line of David as a new king and restore Israel to Davidic glory. More immediately, the promise raises the question of how the Davidic dynasty will begin and which of his sons will inaugurate his father's everlasting kingdom. The succession narrative opens with a scene highlighting the ambiguity of David's character. David takes into his home Maribel, also called Mephibosheth, the crippled son of Jonathan and heir of King Saul. David may have had genuine compassion for his friend's son, but also a desire to keep watch on the survivor of a rival dynasty. Now, in my opinion, I don't think that this heir of Saul was much of a threat to David, being crippled as he was. I think it was more an act of kindness, and that's what the Bible seems to emphasize. Because David did have such a great relationship with Jonathan and wanted to take care of his relatives. I don't think that Maribel or Mephibosheth was in any way a political prisoner, and given the affection that he shows later on for David, we see that he's very fond of David and appreciates David for taking care of him. So I look at it more in terms of compassion. But there is the possibility that David at least wanted to keep an eye on any potential survivors of the line of Saul to prevent that lineage from rivaling him again or being a potential threat to his kingdom. Okay, the stage is then set for the famous incident of David's affair with the beautiful Bathsheba. At the level of public affairs, this is a time of war against the neighboring nation, Ammon. Confined to Jerusalem, while his commander Joab leads the war against the Ammonites, the restless king is strolling on the roof of the palace when he sees a beautiful woman bathing on a nearby roof. When David learns that the woman is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who is one of his mercenaries, he orders Bathsheba brought to him. They sleep together and she becomes pregnant. David then acts to cover up his sin, bringing Uriah home from the war and instructing him to go home, obviously, so he will have intercourse with Bathsheba and cover up the king's act. But Uriah refuses to violate the taboo against sexual intercourse with by soldiers consecrated for war, and he refuses to even go home and sleep in his own bed while his comrades are sleeping on the field. So the tragic consequences of David's sin begin to play out, and greater sin follows. David then has to order his commander Joab to place Uriah in the hardest of the fighting, where he will surely be killed. Joab obeys, even sacrificing elite troops in the process of ensuring Uriah's death, which is essentially murder if Uriah was the purpose. He then displays a cynical response. That's David that displays a cynical response upon learning news of Uriah's death, as though it were mere chance, when he more or less made certain it was going to happen. The cover up is complete when David then marries Bathsheba and a son is born. But this is not the end, as the Lord sends the prophet Nathan to David. David's compassion and sense of justice are used to condemn him, as Nathan tells him a parable, which is a fictional story that has a point, a symbolic meaning. So a parable of a rich man who arrogantly takes a poor man's only ewe lamb. When David demands that this man must pay, Nathan affirms that he is the man. With hindsight on the tragedies that were to befall David and his family, the narrative offers the theological explanation that it is David's sin that is at the root of the tragic events that unfold. As a result of his sin, David's first son by Bathsheba dies. The once proud and cynical king is now a humbled mourner, lying on the ground beside his dying son. A second son is born, Solomon, successor to David, who brings the nation Israel to the pinnacle of its glory. The remainder of this narrative weaves a tangled web of intrigue, passion, and power plays. First, David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. When David refuses to respond, Tamar's brother Absalom takes vengeance by killing Amnon. Hostility leads to a rebellion by Absalom, the flight of David, and ultimately the death of Absalom at the hands of Joab, and David's heartfelt lament at the death of his son. Finally, Solomon re-enters the drama and rises to power. Now, our textbook argues that the prophet Nathan manipulated the process and confused the now older and feeble David into thinking he had made an oath to name Solomon his successor, but the Bible neither affirms or denies such an oath was made. Instead, it makes this plot, or this sort of intrigue, a response to another plot, which is the premature claim of David's older son, Adonijah, to the throne. He's supported by Joab. He claims that he's the next king even before David dies or names him. But it does sure seem in the Bible that David goes along with, and maybe it did intend for Solomon to succeed him and not Adonijah. The succession narrative portrays a diminished public role for the deity. Never does the Lord directly intercede with miracles or with direct revelation to principal characters. Here, the Lord speaks only through the parables of prophets and acts indirectly or not at all. In this sense, the story is a secular tale. Uh, the complex flow of events is the result of human decisions and actions. Let's turn to the historical world. There is more literary evidence in the Bible for the reigns of David and Solomon than for virtually any other period of biblical history. However, a historical analysis of this period must be more than a review of the history from the biblical books, supplemented by observations from archaeological and anthropological research. Following the death of Saul, a combination of appropriate circumstances and Davidic military and political skill made Israel a force to be reckoned with. The achievements of David were consolidated under Solomon, so that this period was the glory age for Israel as a nation state, even a mini empire. Many of the minimalist literary critics regard the entire history of the Israelite monarchy as fiction, and David is dismissed as a fictitious founder hero, maybe comparable to legendary kings like King Arthur. The recently discovered 9th century Aramaean House of David inscriptions or inscription from Tel Dan is perhaps the most important archaeological evidence for the early emergence of the Jerusalem dynasty, if not the founder himself, meaning David. Foreigners know and use the title less than a century after David's probable lifetime. In addition, the stepped stone structure is a massive retaining structure stabilizing a steep hillside in the city of David. Parts of it were exposed, but not enough to permit a full interpretation, and interpreters debate whether the structure comes from the Davidic age, earlier, or even centuries later. It may be hoped that discussions among archaeologists will resolve this puzzle so this great masonry monument may be understood in its proper historical context. Archaeologists have noted for some time that the Israelite monarchy of the divided kingdom, centered in Samaria, was in absolute terms wealthier and more powerful in the 9th century than the united monarchy of the 10th century. Although the international political situation may have put David and Solomon in a relatively more influential position, monumental building was attributed to Solomon, though his greatest projects in Jerusalem were on and immediately adjacent to the Temple Mount, where archaeological work is not currently possible due to Muslim and Jewish sentiments. The volume of inscriptional evidence and archival tablets from Assyrian and Babylonian sources that name Israelite and Judean rulers and that narrate events recounted in the Book of Kings increases as we move from the 9th down to the 8th, 7th, and 6th centuries BCE. The challenge to the minimalists is to explain away a substantial body of archaeological data. Most rigorous empirical historians would conclude that the former prophets, despite difficulties, offer a reliable outline of the history of Israel and Judah. So let's look more closely at David. Son of a notable Judean family, David appeared in Saul's court as a talented young soldier with great popular appeal, who became commander of the royal bodyguard, closest friend of the crown prince Jonathan, and son-in-law of the king through his daughter Michal. David was to some degree the victim of his own success, as Saul began to suspect that David had designs on his crown. The narrative, with an obvious pro-Davidic perspective, portrays David as fully loyal to Saul, but finally obliged to flee for his life. After a brief refuge in Philistia, David became a fugitive in the hills of the native Judah, or his native Judah. Some of his own kinsmen, and in a sordid company of fugitives rallied to his standard and became the nucleus of his legendary infantry army that provided the instrument of David's triumphs. Saul perceived David with an armed company as an even greater threat to security and came after him with this professional army. David eluded pursuit and, according to the traditions, refused multiple opportunities to kill Saul. Meanwhile, he used his band to defend his Judean kinsmen from the Philistines and other enemies. David finally withdrew into Philistine territory to escape Saul's tenacious pursuit and took his troops into the service of Achish, king of Gath, who gave David the border town of Ziklag as his personal hold. The news of Saul's death led David to remove himself from his Philistine exile. Each step reflected his political genius. He had exercised great care to ingratiate himself with his Judean kinsmen by defending them against their enemies, by sharing with the elders the booty of his own raids, and by sparing them the embarrassment of choosing between Saul and him. He further executed an Amalekite adventurer who claimed credit for Saul's death and rewarded the men of Jabesh Gilead for recovering Saul's desecrated corpse after Saul died, actually by suicide, in a battle with the Philistines. Prompted by a favorable word from God, David marched his 600 professional warriors from Ziklag up to Hebron, the principal town of Judah, where the elders of Judah proclaimed him king over their tribe. Conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul ensued, with the balance turning in David's favor. Though Joab's murder of Saul's commander Abner and the murder of Saul's son Ishmael or Ishbosheth threatened to upset David's plans, he absolved himself in a way that actually advanced his interests. So he made clear, or he mourned for them in a way that made clear that he himself was not responsible for these acts of murder. In due course, the elders of the northern Israelite tribes showed up in Hebron to acclaim and anoint him king over the rest of Saul's former dominion. David acted quickly to solidify his kingdom, given that Hebron was too far south and too closely identified with Judah to be a proper capital for all Israel. He seized the Jebusite stronghold of Jerusalem beside the watershed highway between Judah and Benjamin, and a neutral site in relation to tribal rivalries. Now, since the 19th century discovery of Warren's Shaft, connected to the Bronze Age tunnel system for bringing water from the Gihon Springs into Jerusalem, it had been assumed by many to be the avenue by which Joab and David's elite warriors gained surprise access to the city. However, recent investigations suggest that it was not connected with the tunnels that were opened in the 10th century. Nevertheless, the water tunnels were the means by which David's troops achieved this victory, showing impressive military intelligence. Since the Battle of Gilboa 7 years earlier, the Philistines had been uninvolved in the narrative, but David's capture of Jerusalem jarred them into action. They sent a force against Jerusalem, but David escaped. And twice they laid siege to Jerusalem, permitting David to attack them from an unexpected quarter, pressing his second pursuit into Philistia itself and exacting a toll that probably ensured his ultimate victory. He then made a generous peace with Philistia, limiting its territory to the lands surrounding its 5 cities on the southern coastal plains, while allowing it to retain its own governments under treaty alliances with David. The lowland city-states and their rich farmlands and orchards came into David's control with the defeat of Philistia. Under David, the land of Canaan finally became the land of Israel. He completed the conquest begun by Joshua. To the northwest in Phoenicia, Hiram of Tyre entered friendly and mutually beneficial treaty relationships with David. However, things were not so tranquil east of the Jordan Valley, as warfare erupted between Israel and Moab. With the Moabite War, David embarked on the path of empire, subjecting the territory of another people, arousing suspicions among the other peoples of the Transjordan that led to war against Ammon, Aramea or Syria, and Edom, as well as additional conquests. Under David, the religion of the Lord became a state religion centered in the royal capital of Jerusalem. Anthropologists have shown that national religious institutions develop only when a state-level organization that both needs and supports them arises. David apparently elevated the Levites, known for their zeal for Yahweh, to the status of a national priesthood, and his patronage was reciprocated by Levitical loyalty to the royal house. David was a modest monarch, though larger than Saul's. The royal bureaucracy lay within very limited bounds. The flow of war booty through the first half of his reign would have spared Israel and Judah the burden of heavy taxation, though David was capable of extracting taxes when they were needed and perhaps of conscripting the militia. In spite of the relatively light burden that David's administration constituted, the later years of his reign were troubled by revolutions led by his own sons. We've seen that with Absalom, and then also at the very end with Adonijah, who tried to claim the throne before David died. Now, Absalom's campaign to gain popular support suggests that David's administration, though able in war, was incompetent to deal with peace. Further, the monarchy that had come into being as a response to the Philistine menace might seem a dispensable luxury once that threat was eliminated. All right, now we'll look at Solomon. Tradition remembers Solomon for two things: his wisdom and the building of the Jerusalem temple. The wisdom for which Solomon was remembered was the ancient counterpart of a university education in business and public administration. Solomon gave Israel an executive organization, including reorganization of the kingdom into tax districts that cut across traditional tribal boundaries and were capable of raising the revenue and forced labor to support a splendid royal superstructure. Solomon also spent twice as long constructing his own palace as he did the Lord's house, although the subsequent importance of the temple is beyond imagination. Modern archaeology has revealed impressive Solomonic fortifications and splendid administrative uh, structures. Militarily, Solomon opted for a more traditional imperial establishment than the small, highly mobile professional field army of David, requiring an extensive system of fixed fortifications, a large chariot force based in the lowland fortress cities, as well as an infantry. All this was costly to sustain. Solomon also launched a state-owned trading enterprise that took advantage of Israel's strategic location on the named overland arteries between Africa and Asia. He entered into a merchant marine venture with Hiram of Tyre, which seemed to concentrate on luxury trade. Despite tribute from foreign territories, Israel itself was obliged to support the imperial establishment with taxes and forced labor. On the one hand, Solomon's reign was a time of peace and prosperity, a golden era for those in a position to enjoy it, and an international reputation for wisdom and splendor. However, there were signs of trouble. Outside Israel, Solomon seemed unable to maintain David's control of the empire. The aggressive Shishak of Egypt would later start a campaign that would ravage the land. Internally, important factions were seriously disaffected. Before the end of Solomon's long reign, tribal rivalries were worsened by Solomon's apparent policy of giving his native Judah a tax advantage. The heavy burden of taxation and forced labor alienated the elders and people of the northern tribes. Solomon's taste for splendor angered the Levitical priesthood, and both they and the emerging prophetic party were disenchanted with Solomon's practice of making diplomatic marriages and then permitting his foreign brides to practice their religions in Jerusalem. And Solomon was suspected of not only condoning but also participating in cultic practices that were considered abominable by the Torah, or worshiping other gods. And Solomon's heir was not as wise as he himself was supposed to be. We'll turn now and look at from empire to exile, the divided kingdom, 1 Kings 12 through 22 and 2 Kings. And we'll talk about the literary world, the patterning of history in Kings. The books of Kings might best be called a historical overview of the period from the end of the reign of David in 961 BCE to the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah in 587 BCE, with a postscript concerning the release of the exiled King Jehoiakim from prison in Babylon some years later. The narrative assumes that readers have access to the chronicles on which this sketch is based, named in the text but now lost. When you read the books of Kings, it mentions the books of the Annals of the Kings or Chronicles of the Kings, or they might name specific kings, but those are not the same as the biblical books that we have. The books that it names no longer exist or no longer survived or were not preserved historically. So the purpose is not a detailed account of events in the books of Kings, but a survey that reveals the pattern evident in the story of this period and highlights crucial moments. One important internal indication of the patterning in kings is the repeated use of a formula that summarizes and assesses the reigns of the kings. The formula includes a reference to another historical source, a statement about the length of the subject's reign, and the naming of his successor. In the case of Solomon, the fatal flaw in his reign is identified, which was the cause of the rupture of the United Kingdom, according to the narrative. That is, that Solomon forsook the Lord and worshipped other gods. Each subsequent king of the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel also receives an evaluation, followed by a summarizing formula. Jeroboam, the first king of the north after the split, had been promised a sure dynasty if he was obedient to the Lord, but he too fell victim to idolatry. Because of the sins of Jeroboam, the promise of a dynasty is invalid and the northern kingdom will eventually be destroyed. Under Rehoboam, Solomon's successor in Judah, idolatry continued, and a note is added about royal and temple treasures that Rehoboam handed over to Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt to spare Jerusalem. Every king of the north is given a negative assessment, generally with the note that he followed in the sins of Jeroboam. Most kings of Judah are chastised, like Solomon and Rehoboam, with comments that their hearts were not true to the Lord, as the heart of David. Only two southern kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, are given a really high evaluation. Both championed reforms aimed at removing idolatry from the temple and Jerusalem and keeping the commandments of the Lord. A few other kings of the south, Asa, Jehoash, Azariah, and Jotham, are given qualified approval. They did what was right except for failing to remove shrines outside Jerusalem. The twin concerns in the narrative's evaluation of kings is restriction of worship outside Jerusalem and obedience to the commandments of the Lord. Another indication of the patterning of history is in the kings is the role of prophets. The crucial role played by the prophet Nathan in the story of David has been noted. Another prophet named Ahijah figures prominently in the sections on Solomon and Jeroboam, first announcing judgment on Solomon for his sins, and then on Jeroboam for his. Another prophet named Jehu is mentioned in a similar role. The overview of the reigns of the kings is interrupted by an extended narrative on the prophet Elijah, who was active in Israel while the king Ahab becomes a secondary character in the story. Another unnamed prophet is dominant in a chapter that is not concerned with Elijah. That's 1 Kings chapter 20. In 2 Kings 22, I'm sorry, 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah is the focus of a fascinating story involving a conflict among a true prophet who says one thing, false prophets who say something else, and a king, that's also Ahab, who ignores the advice of the true prophet and pays the price of death in battle. Afterward, Elijah reappears and is succeeded by Elisha, who are with overviews of the kings intermingled with the story of Elisha for much of 1 Kings, or 2 Kings. The role of the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem is also highlighted. So crucial are the prophets to the narrative that every significant act of destruction is foretold by a prophet, creating a pattern of prophecy and fulfillment. In this way, all disasters, including the greatest, which is the Babylonian exile, are linked to covenantal disobedience, with the people warned by the Lord via prophets of the consequences of their actions. The ending of Kings gives us still another indication of the patterning of history. Both Israel and Judah have been conquered by foreign nations, and the temple has been destroyed. This is the terrible price for failure to be obedient to the law of the Lord. Yet the narrative ends with a glimmer of hope, with a postscript that says the Davidic king has been freed from prison and is being treated well in Babylonian exile. Though in jeopardy, the promise to the house of David is not lost. The ancestral promise is in a similar situation. By the end of Kings, many of the people are separated from the land. Israel, Judah is no longer a great nation, and the people are not blessed by the Lord. Moses' warning of the judgment due to disobedience has been realized. Yet there is hope, as the promise to the Davidic house is still alive, and the Sinai covenant has not been invalidated, even though it was disobeyed. All right, let's look now at the historical world. The institution of kingship was only a century old when Solomon died. The empire had begun to face strain even in Solomon's lifetime, and a substantial proportion of his revenues had to be raised from domestic sources. But Israel was not a wealthy nation. Solomon's death around 922 BCE found Jerusalem and Judah ready to acknowledge the dynastic principle, and they accepted the crown prince Rehoboam as king. But Rehoboam still had to be confirmed by an assembly of tribal elders at Shechem before he could be recognized as king of all Israel. Jeroboam showed up armed with the warrant of prophetic support. He had been told by a prophet that he's going to be king. Rehoboam was confronted by a restless assembly protesting Solomon's exploitative policies and demanding a less rigorous order. After listening to the wrong advisors, Rehoboam pledged his reign to harsher rather than milder policies. The restless tribesmen thus became active rebels. Rehoboam, in desperation, mustered the militias of Judah and Benjamin, which alone remained loyal, in hopes of suppressing the revolt. The prophet Shemaiah warned against fratricidal warfare, or brothers killing brothers in this case, and so the militia went home. The Shechem assembly anointed Jeroboam king over the northern tribes, which now became the kingdom of Israel, and Rehoboam was left to rule over a southern kingdom, which included Judah and Benjamin. This period of chaos opened a door for a campaign by Pharaoh Shishak, and archaeological evidence shows that Shishak directed more of his destruction against the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was larger, stronger, and more populous. It also had the best agricultural land and most important strategic points and fortress cities along its main transport route. The northern kingdom really had no fixed capital in its early decades. The royal residence was most often at Tirzah. Israel gained a permanent capital and royal citadel when Omri built the new city of Samaria, which proved to be a formidable fortress as seen in the massive fortifications discovered by archaeologists. Dynastic instability was characteristic of the Northern Kingdom. The existence of a professional army with ambitious generals was a destabilizing element. The usual course was for a strong king to die in bed or battle, and his dynastic heir to be assassinated by a senior military officer who would make himself king. The process would be repeated unless the usurper himself fell to another conspirator first. Only two northern ruling houses, those of Omri and Jehu, extended through 4 reigns. The more exposed and strategic situation of the Northern Kingdom probably meant that it could not avoid entanglement in international power politics, with the shifting fortunes and ultimate doom involved. Judah, though smaller and poorer, might have avoided that ruinous game in its mountain terrain and remained neutral, but its best kings could not resist the temptation to try to restore the Davidic kingdom and in the process come into tension with the political power of empires. Even so, Judah survived its stronger northern neighbor by a century and a half. Royal stability characterized Judah. The Davidic dynasty ruled nearly uninterrupted to the end of the kingdom and even beyond. Jerusalem was Judah's capital throughout to the fall of the kingdom. 3 periods of international crisis punctuated the history narrated in the former prophets: the Aramean wars of the mid-9th century, the Assyrian conquests of the mid-8th to mid-7th centuries, and the Babylonian conquests of the late 7th to early 6th centuries. Israel and the Aramean kingdom of Damascus were the prime adversaries of the 9th century wars. Omri was the architect of the success Israel enjoyed during the Aramean wars, nurturing an alliance with Judah in which the Judeans became vassals and solidifying an alliance with the Phoenician city-states through a diplomatic marriage between his son Ahab and Jezebel, the princess of Sidon. One of the most interesting archaeological documents relating to the Hebrew scriptures comes from this period. That is an inscription from Mesha, king of Moab, that recounts the events narrated in 2 Kings 3, 4 through 27 from the Moabite perspective. The rebellion of Jehu, instigated by a prophetic faction, brought down Omri's dynasty and made a ruin of his diplomatic achievements. The mad chariot general Jehu exterminated the line of Omri and also massacred the king of Judah and his brothers when they crossed his path, accomplished the murder of Jezebel, and slaughtered worshippers of the Phoenician god Baal in Samaria. The menacing effects of Jehu's foolish actions were mitigated for Israel by external forces. Assyria greatly weakened Damascus and then obligingly went into a period of dormancy, paving the way for a long, peaceful, and prosperous reign of Jeroboam II in Israel and its counterpart in Judah under Uzziah, also known as Azariah. The reigns of these 2 kings constituted a sort of golden age, and their deaths marked its end. Much of the remaining history narrated in the former prophets will be examined in our account of the latter prophets, so we'll thus conclude our treatment here with a sequential summary. Israel and Aramea, or Syria, tried to organize a coalition to oppose Assyrian expansion, They went to the extent of war against Judah to compel cooperation, but the scheme misfired. Damascus fell to the Assyrian Tiglath-Pileser III's legions in 732 and Samaria to Sargon II in 722 after a 3-year siege. Judah had a brief renaissance under the nationalist reformer Hezekiah, who reconstituted the Davidic kingdom under the nose of Assyria. Many historians believe that Hezekiah's tunnel, dated by a team of scholars to the period around 700 BCE, which is the time of Hezekiah, was built to secure Jerusalem's water supply against an expected Assyrian siege. Assyria pressed on in the next century to conquer and rule Egypt. The long reign of Manasseh in Judah, the obedient vassal of Assyria, and Israel's most wicked king, actually, not Assyria's, or Judah's wicked king, rather, filled the middle years of the 7th century. The beginning of Assyria's sudden collapse caused by the Medo-Babylonian alliance coincided roughly with the coming of age of the former boy king Josiah in Judah. Josiah was another reforming nationalist like Hezekiah. He died in 609 BCE in a futile attempt to prevent Pharaoh Necho II's equally futile expedition to fortify the last remnants of Assyria. The Judean monarchy became an imperial pawn following Josiah's death. The Egyptians deposed Josiah's acclaimed heir, Jehoaz, and installed Jehoiakim. He offended Babylonian interests and died just in time to avoid Nebuchadnezzar II's invasion of his realm in 597. His heir, Jehoiakim, reigned only long enough to effect a prudent surrender and go away to lifetime exile in Babylon, accompanied by many prominent Judeans. Nebuchadnezzar elevated Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah to king, but Zedekiah allowed himself to be swayed by pro-Egyptian interests and rebelled against Babylon to his own ruin and that of his kingdom in 587. Our literary analysis has already recounted the hopeful note on which the former prophets end. Jehoiakim was elevated to a place in the court of the Babylonian emperor, evil Merodach, about 561. That's his name. That's not saying he's an evil person, but that is his name. But Jerusalem was still in ruins, and the other prominent Judeans exiled during the Babylonian campaigns remained in exile. Okay, we're almost finished, but I want to take just a few minutes and at least start looking at this chapter 6 on the covenant advocates, the prophets of ancient Israel, and more specifically, that's the latter prophets. In modern terminology, a prophet is someone who predicts future events before they occur, and to prophesy is simply to predict. So this definition must be set aside to understand the prophets of ancient Israel. Although biblical prophets often spoke of the future, their concern was not prediction, and their predictions were usually conditional, encouraging people to follow the way of the Torah. The prophets were not so much foretellers as, or who spoke, or foretellers as forthtellers who spoke the word of the Lord to the people of their own time. Let's look at prophecy as a social phenomenon. Every human culture has had techniques for establishing contact with holiness, with the realm of reality beyond the ordinary, everyday world of time and space. Anthropologists call this realm the spirit world. Human attempts to communicate with the spirit world usually fall into two categories. On the one hand are persons called shamans who seem to have an inborn talent or gift for moving between the normal world and spirit world. On the other hand, are the manipulative techniques or professional skills that give access to the spirit realm, including medicine men and women, and methods used by priests, fortune tellers, spirit mediums, and diviners. Ancient Near Eastern cultures witnessed both phenomena. Many passages of the biblical prophetic books refer to the hand or spirit of the Lord being on the prophet in a form of shaman like possession. Other important prophetic passages suggest that the prophets found themselves in the court of the Lord, surrounded by the heavenly council. These data suggest that the prophets of ancient Israel should be associated with the spontaneous or charismatic side of religious behavior. The precise form of Israelite prophetic behavior is less clear. The Hebrew term for prophet, nabi, seems to support the notion that prophets were speakers who carried from the divine realm to the earthly, who carried messages from the divine realm to the earthly. Prophets were perceived as useful persons to have about. Other means of consulting the spirit realm had serious limitations. Lots could generally be cast. Lots that were cast could only generally say yes, no, or maybe. Omens were vague, and oracles were ambiguous, or words given either by prophets or specific occasions, but less formal. They were ambiguous. We didn't quite know what they meant. They could be misinterpreted easily. A prophet in direct communication with the spirit realm could elicit a more expansive response. But a prophet could also be a dangerous person to have around, given the common folk belief in the effective power of word formulas such as blessings and curses that prophets often used. Some prophets were associated with shrines in the temple, and these are called cultic prophets. Others were members of the court, known as royal prophets. Some belonged to guilds or bands, such as those headed by Samuel and Elisha. Isaiah of Jerusalem also had disciples. So the words spoken forth by the prophet might be as commonplace as Samuel's information to Saul about the fate of his father's herd of lost donkeys, and it was frequently a response to everyday inquiries. But Samuel also anointed and denounced kings, and Elijah, Elisha, and Nathan felt themselves commissioned to make and unmake monarchs. Nathan, Gad, Isaiah, and Jeremiah advised kings. A number of prophets announced oracles bearing on matters of high policy. The prophets mentioned in the Bible were a minority of the prophets who flourished in ancient Israel. The biblical prophets understood themselves not merely as having access to the spirit world, but also as being ambassadors of the divine court to the earthly seats of power. It is in this role that they can be seen as advocates of the Mosaic covenant, the holy treaty that formalized the special relationship between the Lord and Israel. To judge from the surviving materials, each prophet had particular points of interest and emphasis. However, they all shared in common an uncompromising demand for justice and righteousness, conditions representing the divine intentions as made explicit in the Torah, a religiously faithful people living under a decent government that sought to create a just and humane social order. Given their source of authority, it is not surprising that the biblical prophets vigorously denounced the worship of other gods, whether it was for political purposes or devotional ends. Prophets concerned themselves with the future in the sense of being ambassadors. They brought messages warning what would happen if covenant abuse continued. That is, their predictions were addressed to immediate circumstances. For example, when Isaiah spoke his message to King Ahaz about the birth of a child named Emmanuel, he was addressing the situation of his time. Later, the hope of a restored Davidic covenant or Davidic ruler came to be associated with the term Messiah, translated into Greek as Christos, from which we derive Christ, one of the titles associated with Jesus of Nazareth. In general, in the Tanakh, the word Messiah, which simply means anointed, refers to someone who has been anointed with oil. Both kings and priests in ancient Israel were anointed at their initiation. By extension, it may apply to anyone empowered by God for a particular task. Although the concept of Messiah later came to be associated with the hope that God would lift up an ideal king to restore the Davidic dynasty and the Israelite nation, it is important to note that none of the prophetic books of the Tanakh use the term with this specialized meaning. There is one major exception to the rule of immediacy in prophetic predictions. Some oracles forecast an age when the divine promises to Israel will be realized. Some foretell blessings for all nations. Before the Babylonian exile, which marked the practical end of the Davidic dynasty, prophets in Judah might speak of an ideal king of David's line, unlike the monarchs they had to deal with. After the exile, there was no court and thus no need for ambassadors. Later, rabbinic interpretation held that prophetic inspiration ceased in the time of Ezra. Regardless, the role of prophecy diminished with changes in circumstance, and eventually prophecy itself faded. But for popular religion, the spirit of prophecy was maintained and the hope of a restored age of glory. All right, we'll stop our lecture for here today. I've given you your primary text, 2 Samuel 11, which is the story of David and Bathsheba. I'd like to give you one actual reading from the Bible. So that's every week. That's the reading for this week. And for the attendance assignment, it's the same questions. Did you watch the lecture video? And what is the main idea you took from this week's lecture? And if you want to do the extra credits, you can read 2 Samuel 11 and answer the following question. Summarize the story of David and Bathsheba in your own words. What warnings and lessons can be learned from the story of David's wrongdoing? Can you relate this story to modern incidents of political leaders who sought to cover up their misdeeds? Why is it difficult for humans in general to face up to their failures? Okay, so that is the assignment for this week, and we've got a few minutes left. Let me open up the study guide. We'll go over that really quick, and next week there'll be no lecture. There'll just be the exam, the midterm exam. So this is the study guide for you to prepare for that. Now, please note that you do not need to submit the answers to the study guide to me. You will not earn any credit for doing so, but the study guide is meant to help you prepare for next week's exam. The test will include mostly multiple choice, true and false, and a small number of matching questions. There'll also be a few short essay questions, and it's an extra credit. I'd like to give you a chance to earn extra credit to get the best possible grades. So the study guide gives you 25 questions from which the main test questions will be drawn. If you can answer these questions, you should be able to answer the main test questions, but extra credit questions may be drawn from additional class notes that are not included in the study guide. Okay, so these are the questions that might be included as multiple choice, true and false, or matching. Number one, name the three worlds of the Bible according to our text. Number two, what is the Tanakh? Number three, what is the New Testament? Number four, what is Canonization, what does that mean? Number 5, what are the 3 main parts of the Old Testament according to the Hebrew categorization, which is a little different than the Christian, the Greek or Christian or current English categorization. Number 6, what is intrinsic study? Number 7, what is extrinsic study? Number 8, what nations are dominant during the time of the Bible? Number 9, the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the blank. Number 10, the book of blank, the first book of the Bible, is about beginnings. Number 11, God called blank to leave his home and people, ultimately to become the father of the people of Israel. Number 12, the first man God created was named blank. Number 13, blank, which often appears in English Bibles as the Lord in capital letters and means I am who I am, is the name God says when Moses asks for his name. Number 14, the book of blank is about Israel leaving Egypt. 15, blank was sent by God to deliver Israel from Egypt. 16, at Mount Sinai, Moses received tablets of law known as blank. 17, blank led the people of Israel into Canaan. 18, the blank were tribal leaders who delivered Israel from oppressors. For 19, what is the name of Israel's first king? Number 20, what is the name of the final one to hold the position of judge, who then anoints the first 2 kings of Israel? 21, what is the name of the second king of Israel? 22, what city does David conquer to make the capital of Israel? 23, which of David's sons becomes king after him and later builds the temple? 24, after the kingdom splits, blank is the northern kingdom and blank is the southern kingdom. 25, what is a prophet? Okay, now I've given you some examples here of questions that may appear as short essay questions, but I may also take the questions from the homework extra credit. I may also ask those questions to you for a short essay, so you may want to go back and review those as well. Number 1, why should we study the Bible? What relevance does it have for life and society today? And number 2, describe some of the types of literature in the Bible. So when I ask these questions, it'll be kind of similar to what I'm looking for in the homework, maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs to fully answer these questions. Give some examples if you can. That's the study guide. Hope that helps you prepare for the midterm exam. Hope you're all doing well. Have a great week. Take care. We'll see you later.